in June 1948, right in the middle of the atrocities, to bar refugee return, leaving the Palestinians crushed with some 700,000 driven into exile. Morris is critical of Israeli atrocities, in part because they're too limited. Ben-Gurion's great error, he says, perhaps a fatal mistake, was not to have cleansed the whole country, the whole land of Israel, as far as the Jordan River. There's actually evidence, just appeared in the last few days, from recently declassified Israeli cabinet records that Ben-Gurion apparently had the same reaction to the failure, the fatal mistake of not completing the purification of the land, as it's called. From the earliest days, Arabs were regarded as an alien implant in the land of Israel. As the Balfour Declaration was released, Chaim Weizmann, who, as you know, Israel's first president, the most respected Zionist figure, he remarked that the British had informed him that in Palestine there are a few 100,000 Negroes, Schwarzes, actually, he said, but that's a matter of no significance. Weizmann, in turn, had informed Lord Balfour that the issue known as the Arab problem in Palestine will be of merely local character, and in effect, anyone cognizant of the situation does not consider it a highly significant factor. So displacement of the inhabitants by a Jewish settlement raises no moral issue. A later president, Israeli president, Chaim Herzog, also incidentally a labor dove, he articulated the basic guidelines in 1972. The date's important. This is often attributed to Menachem Begin and Likud, but it's not. It's an old Labor Party program. He said, I do not deny the Palestinians any place or stand or opinion on every matter, but certainly I am not prepared to consider them as partners in any respect in a land that has been consecrated in the hands of our nation for thousands of years. For the Jews of this land, there cannot be any partner. That's the doves that I'm quoting, the humanists. Lord Balfour himself, who was a devoted Christian Zionist, he expressed similar views. These were actually quite a common element of elite Christian Zionism, which long predates Jewish Zionism. It included leading figures in the United States as well. That was primarily a British phenomenon. They were immersed in the Holy Book with lessons that the land of Israel was promised to the Jews. Others are interlopers, Woodrow Wilson, and Harry Truman, many others. That's, for example, why one of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's leading advisors, an important cabinet member, described the Jewish return to Palestine as the most remarkable event in history. In the United States, a traditional elite Christian Zionism is now buttressed by an enormous right-wing Christian movement, passionately pro-Israel, deeply anti-Semitic. It forms much of the current base of the current Republican Party. It's important to recognize that, to understand lots of things that take place regularly, like the Chuck Hagel hearings a few weeks ago. Christian Zionism is an important factor in shaping policy towards Israel-Palestine from early years. There are others. It's noteworthy, for example, that the strongest support for Israel in the international arena comes from the countries that are called the Anglosphere, Britain and its offshoots, U.S., Canada, and Australia. These are unusual in the history of imperialism, and that they're settler colonial societies based on extermination or expulsion of indigenous populations in favor of a higher race. And in them, such behavior is kind of instinctively considered natural and praiseworthy. So what Israel's doing looks entirely normal, quite apart from the religious element. The crucial factors, certainly since 1967, are strategic and economic and still prevail, but others shouldn't be overlooked. Well, going back to Gaza, after Israel's 1967 conquests, its torture took new forms, too many, too awful to review. All seemed to be pretty much under control until December 1987, when the Intifada suddenly broke out, first in Gaza, spreading quickly throughout the territories. Largely nonviolent, it stimulated quite impressive popular organization. Anyone who visited, I was there, could see that. Large respects revolt against the feudal society, the Palestinian society. It elicited brutal repression, reached its peak of savagery under the orders of Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin, another admired dove. He informed a Peace Now delegation at the peak of the state crimes that meaningless U.S. dialogue with the PLO was designed to grant Israel, I'm quoting him, at least a year to suppress the uprising by force. The inhabitants of the territories are subject to harsh military and economic pressure. Rabin explained that in the end they will be broken, abandoning their hopes for a life of dignity. Gaza was placed under closure at that time, breaking any connection to the rest of Palestine. This was extended shortly after within the framework of the Oslo Accords of 1993, which, if anyone cares, declared that Gaza and the West Bank are an indivisible territorial unity which cannot be separated. U.S. and Israel were doing the opposite. And that remains U.S.-Israeli policy to the present. It's quite significant. Separation of the two regions guarantees that if any limited autonomy is gained in the West Bank, it will have no access to the outside world except through Jordan. And that's being barred by the systematic expulsion of the inhabitants of the Jordan Valley, expulsions that the Israeli press accurately calls tihur babika, purification of the valley, cleansing of the valley. These are programs that have slowly reduced its population from 300,000 in 1967 to less than 60,000 today. They continue steadily with extreme cruelty. We'll soon be commemorating the 20th anniversary of the Oslo Accords. They were hailed at the time as a historic breakthrough on the path towards resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and not universally hailed, of course, certainly not by prominent Palestinian figures who could see easily what's happening. Among them was Raja Shahada. He was Palestine's leading legal specialist. He'd been trying in vain for years to block Israel's violations of international law in the territories. And he recognized right away that the accords were a surrender in the interests of Israel and the Tunis-based PLO leadership, which was being marginalized within the territories, but is now restored to power through the side channel in Oslo. Another one was Edward Said, who saw exactly what was happening and condemned the capitulation at once. Another was historian Rashid Khalidi. He was actually an advisor to the Palestinian negotiators at the Madrid negotiations. He described the Oslo agreements as an infernal trap. Still another was Haider Abdel-Shafi, who's probably the most respected Palestinian within the territories. He headed the Palestinian delegation at the U.S.-run Madrid negotiations, and he refused to capitulate to U.S.-Israeli demands. He insisted that any agreement must, at the very least, bar illegal Israeli settlement in the territories. That issue was ignored at Oslo, and Abdel Shafi refused to attend the signing of the ceremony on the White House lawn, described as a day of awe in the American press. There were many illusions about Gaza, but no basis for them whatsoever. To understand what was taking place, it was sufficient to read the short several pages of the Declaration of Principles, the document that emerged. These were quite explicit about satisfying Israel's demands and completely silent on Palestinian national rights. Article 1 of the Declaration states that the end result of the process, notice the end result when everything's finished, is to be a permanent settlement based on Security Council resolutions 242 and 338. Anyone familiar with diplomacy knows that these resolutions say nothing at all about Palestinian rights, apart from a vague reference to just settlement of the refugee problem, no mention of Palestinians. There are UN resolutions referring to Palestinian national rights, but these were ignored in the Declaration of Principles. So if the culmination of the peace process would be as clearly articulated in the Declaration of Principles, then Palestinians could kiss goodbye to any hopes for some meaningful form of autonomy, of national rights in the former Palestine. The assault on the people of Gaza mounted very sharply in January 2006, when Palestinians committed one of their major crimes. In the first free election in the Arab world, they voted the wrong way. Such insubordination conflicts very sharply with the really existing passion for democracy that's regularly proclaimed by Western leaders and the political class. And at once, the U.S. and Israel, with Europe toddling obediently behind, as it usually does, instituted harsh measures to punish the miscreants. Actually, punishment became even more severe a year later when Gazans committed an even worse crime. Immediately after the elections, with their unwelcome outcome, Washington turned to standard operating procedure when criminal populations vote improperly, prepare a military coup. This was to be led by Fatah strongman Muhammad Dahlan. The elected government preempted the coup. That's an event denounced in the West as Hamas's violent takeover of Gaza, the context suppressed. It's bad enough to vote the wrong way in a free election, but preventing a U.S.-run military coup to overthrow the government, that's a truly unspeakable crime. And accordingly, the siege and the other punishments were sharply increased in retaliation. We then move on to Operation Cast Lead, other atrocities. I won't review the shocking story, which Westerners should know by heart, given their critical role throughout. Well, throughout these years, Gaza has been a showcase for violence of every imaginable kind. The record shows such sadistic and very carefully planned atrocities as Operation Cast Lead, called infanticide by the Norwegian physician Mats Gilbert, who worked tirelessly at Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital with his dedicated Palestinian and Norwegian colleagues right through the criminal assault. The term infanticide is appropriate. Hundreds of children were massacred. And from there, the violence ranges through just about every kind of cruelty that humans have used their higher mental faculties to devise, up to the pain of exile that Edward Said wrote about so eloquently. This is particularly stark in Gaza, where older people can still look across the border towards the homes a few miles away from which they were driven. Or, to be more precise, they could do that if they were able to approach the border without being killed. One form of punishment has been to